This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. For 13-year-old Chica, this small, sleepy town was both home and a prison. He had grown up in one of the poorest families in the village, his father a farmer who barely scraped together enough to feed the family, and his mother long gone, having left when Chica was just a baby. She had disappeared one night, fleeing from the suffocating poverty and leaving Chica and his younger sister, Ngozi, to fend for themselves with their father. The absence of a mother in their home had left an emptiness that Chica never quite knew how to fill. His father did his best, but years of hard labor had made him a bitter, worn-out man who spoke little and drank much. Chica, though still a boy, had already been forced to grow up faster than he should have. By the time he turned 10, he was helping his father in the fields, planting cassava and maize, though the harvests were never enough. Schooling had been an occasional privilege, something that came when there was money for books or uniforms, which was rare. More often than not, Chica spent his days wandering through the village, dreaming of a life beyond its borders, a life where he wasn't defined by hunger or the shame of wearing threadbare clothes. He wanted to be more than the village boy, more than the poor child people pitied but did nothing to help. In this world of scarcity, money was everything. It was the difference between life and death, between eating and starving, between living in darkness or lighting a single candle to chase away the night. So when Chica first heard the offer, it was impossible for him to say no. The offer came from Ogona, a man who was not from the village, but whose presence was known and feared. He was an enigma to most, an outsider who had arrived a few years back and quickly set up his own operations on the outskirts of Nimba. Some whispered that he was connected to the criminal underworld, that he ran things in the shadows, pulling the strings that kept the town both afloat and in fear. Ogona was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. His tall, imposing frame made him a figure of intimidation, and his piercing gaze had a way of making even the most confident man shrink back. He always seemed to have money, more money than anyone else in Nimba had ever seen, and he made no effort to hide it. He drove a black Jeep that stood out against the backdrop of poverty, and his clothes were always clean and sharp, a contrast to the tattered garments of the villagers. He didn't mix with the locals, didn't drink palm wine with them at the small bars, and didn't frequent the village gatherings. But he had a network of boys, young men like Chica, who did his bidding, though none spoke openly about what they were tasked with. One afternoon, as Chica loitered near the local market, Ogona approached him. Chica had seen him around before, but this was the first time he had ever spoken directly to him. It was clear from the moment Ogona locked eyes with Chica that this wasn't a social visit. He got straight to the point. There was a job to be done, and he needed someone young, someone who wouldn't be suspected, someone desperate enough to do the unthinkable. The offer was simple: 235 USD in exchange for one task, one life-changing, life-ending task. For Chica, the amount was incomprehensible. 235 American dollars might as well have been 2 million. It was more money than his father made in a year, more money than Chica had ever seen in his entire life. With that kind of money, he could buy new clothes, he could buy food for his family, he could escape Nimba and go to the city, where life was vibrant, full of opportunity, and free from the suffocating grip of poverty. He imagined himself walking down the busy streets of the capital, Lagos or Abuja, or even Accra in Ghana, with his pockets full, no longer the boy everyone looked down on. The allure was too strong. The job, however, was terrifying. Ogona wanted him to kill someone, not just anyone, a family. Chica's mind reeled as Ogona explained that the targets were a man named Kamau, his wife, and their 2 children. Kamau was a well-known figure in the town, a man who had made a name for himself advocating for the rights of marginalized people, particularly the LGBTQ youth, a cause that had earned him both praise and enemies. He was respected by many, but there were just as many who loathed him for challenging the old ways of thinking, for bringing change to a place that wasn't ready for it. Ogona made it clear that this wasn't personal. It was business. Kamau had crossed the wrong people, and now he had to be eliminated. But they wanted it done quietly, without any suspicion. That was where Chica came in. No one would ever suspect a 13-year-old boy of such a heinous act. He was the perfect pawn in a game far larger than he could understand. The weight of the decision crushed Chica. He could feel it pressing down on him, suffocating him, but at the same time, the image of that money kept flashing in his mind. 235 USD. What wouldn't he do for that kind of money? What wouldn't he sacrifice? He told himself that life was unfair, that people like him were never meant to have anything. and that this was his one chance to change his fate. Deep down, he knew that what he was about to do was wrong, deeply and irrevocably wrong. But desperation has a way of twisting the mind, of making the unthinkable seem possible. Ogona didn't give him much time to decide. He simply handed Chica a small gun, the cold metal feeling foreign and dangerous in his hands. It was a cheap weapon, one that could easily be disposed of afterward. Ogona instructed him carefully, giving him the details of the family's routine, telling him when and how to strike. It would be quick, he said. In and out. Chica wouldn't have to see their faces for long. He wouldn't have to hear their voices for more than a moment. That night, as Chica lay on the floor of the small one-room hut he shared with his father and sister, he couldn't sleep. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced with thoughts of what was to come. He tried to picture Kamao's face, the face of the man he was supposed to kill, but all he could see was the money. All he could think about was the life he could have if he went through with it. Morning came, and the sun rose like any other day, casting its harsh light on the town of Nimba. Chica went about his day as if nothing had changed, but inside, he felt a storm brewing. The weight of what he was about to do sat heavy on his chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. But he couldn't back out now. Ogona's eyes, cold and calculating, flashed in his mind. Backing out wasn't an option. If he didn't do this, Ogona would find someone else, and Chica might not live to see another day. The time was set for that night, just after the sun dipped below the horizon, when the shadows grew long, and the village quieted. Chica would slip into Kamao's house through the back, a path he had scouted earlier that day. The house was modest, but bigger than his own, with walls made of concrete instead of mud, and a corrugated roof that didn't leak when it rained. Chica had passed by the house many times, but tonight he would be entering it with a purpose that twisted his stomach into knots. As the day dragged on, Chica could feel his nerves fraying. Every second felt like a countdown to his own destruction. He tried not to think about it too much, tried to push the thoughts of the family, the people he was about to kill, out of his mind. But they kept creeping back in, their faces blurring into shadows in his imagination, haunting him before he had even taken the first step. That evening, as the sky turned a deep purple and the first stars began to dot the sky, Chica made his way to Kamao's house. The gun felt heavy in his hand, a weight that he could barely carry, though it was small enough to hide under his shirt. His heart pounded in his ears as he approached the house, each step feeling like it echoed in the quiet night. This was it. There was no turning back now. 235 USD. That's what his future was worth. That's what this family's lives were worth. Chica's breath hitched as he reached the back of the house, his fingers trembling as he prepared to commit the crime that would change everything. The Kamao family was well known in Nimba, not just for their relative prosperity, but for their compassion, their integrity, and the unique way they stood apart from the rest of the town. In a place where life was hard and the world could often feel unforgiving, the Kamaos had always managed to offer a little warmth and hope to those around them. Their house, one of the few in the village made from solid concrete, with clean white walls and a red-tiled roof, symbolized a different life, one of stability and modest success in a town that barely scraped by. They were the family others looked to with a mixture of admiration and envy. At the head of the household was Mr. Kamao, a middle-aged man with a quiet but commanding presence. He wasn't a man of many words, but when he spoke, people listened. His dark, weathered skin and strong, square jaw gave him the look of a man who had worked hard for everything he had, which was true. Kamao had not come from wealth. Like many in the town, his early life had been shaped by poverty, but through perseverance and a rare educational opportunity, he had risen above his circumstances. He had become a community leader, respected not only for his success but also for his willingness to stand up for those who couldn't speak for themselves. Kamao worked as a teacher in a nearby town, and over the years he had earned a reputation for being deeply invested in the well-being of his students. He believed in the transformative power of education, especially in a place like Nimba, where opportunities were scarce and the future could feel like an unreachable dream. But it wasn't just the academic side of life that he cared about. Kamao was also a vocal advocate for marginalized people, particularly the LGBTQ community, which made him an anomaly in the conservative society of Nimba. It was this advocacy that had earned him admiration from some and hatred from others. In the eyes of many traditionalists, Kamao's work was dangerous, disruptive even, challenging the deeply rooted cultural and religious values that had guided the town for generations. Despite the whispers and side glances, Kamau never wavered in his support for the LGBTQ youth. He had started a small support group in the neighboring town where he worked, discreetly helping those who felt isolated and rejected by their families. For many of the young people he helped, Kamau was more than a mentor, he was a lifeline. But his progressive views put him in conflict with powerful people, individuals like Ogana, who saw his work as a threat to the established order. These people wanted Kamau gone, silenced before he could inspire any more change. Kamau's wife, Adana, was his partner in every sense of the word. She was a strong woman, one whose presence filled the house with a calm that grounded the family. While Kamau was out working most days, Adana ran the household with quiet efficiency. She was the glue that held everything together. Her nurturing spirit and firm but gentle demeanor made her a beloved figure in the community. People would often come to her for advice, for comfort, or even just to sit in her kitchen while she cooked, the rich smells of traditional stews filling the air. Adana had grown up in Nimba, and like Kamau, she had known hardship. Her family had been poor, but they had taught her the value of resilience and kindness. When she married Kamau, she became the pillar of their home, raising their children with a sense of purpose and love. She shared her husband's values, supporting his work, even when it brought danger to their doorstep. Together they formed a unit that was respected but not without controversy. Some in the village whispered that Adana had too much influence over Kamau, that she was too supportive of his modern ideas, which they saw as harmful. But for her, the well-being of their family and the greater good of the community always came first. The Kamau children were bright, lively, and well-loved in the town. Their eldest, Said, was 15. She was a striking girl with her mother's delicate features and her father's quiet strength. Said had inherited her parents' intelligence and sense of justice, which sometimes made her seem older than her years. She had grown up hearing her father's discussions about fairness, equality, and the importance of standing up for what was right, and these lessons had shaped her into a thoughtful, empathetic teenager. Said excelled in school and dreamed of becoming a lawyer one day, hoping to use her future to fight for the rights of those who had none. Said's younger brother Juma was 8 years old, a cheerful, mischievous boy who seemed to always have a smile on his face. Where Said was thoughtful and serious, Juma was playful and carefree, always running through the village with his friends, climbing trees, and inventing games. He had a kind heart and a boundless energy that brought life into the Kamau home, a constant source of joy for his parents. Juma adored his older sister, and though their personalities were different, they shared a close bond. She was his protector, his guide in the small world of Nimba, and he looked up to her with the wide-eyed admiration only a younger sibling could muster. As a family, the Kamau stood out, not just for their relative wealth, but for their warmth and open-heartedness. Their home, though modest by city standards, was considered one of the nicer ones in the village, with a fenced yard where Adana grew vegetables and a front porch where they would often sit in the evenings, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Inside, the house was clean and well kept, with hand-me-down furniture that Adana had lovingly restored, and walls adorned with pictures of the children growing up. Said as a baby, Juma learning to walk, Kamau in his younger days with Adana by his side. But beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect family life, there were cracks forming. Kamau's work had drawn attention from dangerous men like Ogana, who saw his advocacy as a direct threat to their power. Kamau had received warnings, threatening notes left on the doorstep, anonymous letters telling him to stop his work or face the consequences. At first he had brushed them off, believing that his work was too important to abandon. But as the threats grew more frequent and more personal, he had started to worry. Adana, too, had sensed the growing danger. She had noticed the way people in the village had begun to avoid their family, the way conversations seemed to stop when she entered a room. She had always known that Kamau's work might bring trouble, but now it felt closer, more real. She had tried to talk to him about it, but Kamau was stubborn, insistent that they would be fine, that they were protected by the community's respect for them. Yet deep down, Adana felt a growing unease. Said had overheard her parents talking late at night, their voices hushed but tense. She knew something was wrong, though neither of them had told her the full story. She had picked up on the tension in the air, the worried looks her mother gave her father when she thought no one was watching. Said wasn't naive. She had seen the way the villagers had started to treat them differently, and she knew that her father's work had made enemies. But she trusted him. He was her hero, the man who always seemed to know the right thing to do, the man who stood tall in the face of injustice. Juma, being only 8, was blissfully unaware of the danger surrounding them. To him, life was simple: school, playing with his friends, and spending time with his family. He idolized his father and often followed him around, mimicking his mannerisms, pretending to be a teacher or an activist just like him. Juma's world was still one of innocence, a world where the bad things didn't touch him, where the love of his family was enough to shield him from whatever might be lurking outside. It was this innocence that made what was to come so much more heartbreaking. The Kamo family, despite their flaws, despite the mounting danger, had built a life that was full of love, hope, and a sense of purpose. They were not perfect, but they were united. The community had always admired them, even if some had begun to distance themselves out of fear or prejudice. Kamao's work, Adana's strength, Said's intelligence, and Juma's joyfulness had made them a family that represented the best of what Nimba could be. But it also made them a target. Ogana had been watching Kamao for some time, keeping tabs on his movements, his work, and his growing influence. To someone like Ogana, Kamao's advocacy for LGBTQ rights was not just an annoyance, it was a direct threat to his power, to the status quo that allowed men like him to thrive. Ogana represented the darker side of Nimba, the side that operated in shadows, where fear and violence were the tools of control. Kamao, with his progressive ideals and his desire to uplift the marginalized, was undermining the very foundations that Ogana and others like him had built their power on. Kamao's family, as much as he loved them, had become collateral in this larger conflict. Ogana knew that by targeting them, he could send a message not just to Kamao, but to anyone else who might be thinking of following in his footsteps. The crime wouldn't just be about silencing Kamao. It would be about crushing the spirit of those who believed in change, those who thought they could make a difference in a place like Nimba. As Chica prepared to carry out the terrible act that had been set in motion, the Kamao family went about their daily lives, unaware that they were being watched, unaware that their fate had already been sealed. Kamao, Adana, Said, and Juma were living in the eye of a storm they couldn't yet see, a storm that was gathering strength with each passing day. The love that bound them together, the principles that Kamao had worked so hard to instill in his children, would soon be put to the ultimate test in a way no one could have predicted. The family's dynamic, their love, their values, were the very things that had made them a target, and it was only a matter of time before the darkness that had been lurking at the edges of their lives would descend upon them, bringing with it a wave of destruction that would leave Nimba forever changed. The days leading up to the night of the murder were the longest of Chica's young life. Each second seemed to stretch into eternity, and each hour felt like it carried the weight of 1,000. From the moment Ogana handed him the gun, the cold metal slipping into his small, trembling hand, Chica had been consumed by an overwhelming sense of dread. It was a feeling unlike anything he had ever known, thick and suffocating, like a dark cloud that hovered over him, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to function. Every time he touched the gun, he felt a shiver run down his spine, as if the object itself carried the malevolent weight of what he was about to do. Chica tried to go about his days as normally as he could, though nothing felt normal anymore. He woke early, as he always did, helping his father in the fields before the sun became too harsh, the hot African sun burning the backs of their necks as they worked side by side in silence. His father, with his worn, stoic expression and slow, deliberate movements, had no idea what Chica was carrying inside him. Chica wanted to tell him, wanted to confess the horror of the task that had been thrust upon him, but the words never came. He couldn't bring himself to admit to his father, the man who had raised him and struggled to keep their family alive, that he was about to betray everything they stood for. As they tilled the dry, unyielding soil, Chica's mind was far away. He imagined the Kamao family in their home, going about their lives as though nothing was wrong, as though they weren't about to be torn apart. He pictured Mr. Kamao sitting at the head of the dinner table, speaking in his calm, measured voice about whatever work he was doing for the community. Perhaps they were laughing, or maybe they were discussing the future, unaware that theirs was about to be snatched away. It made Chica feel sick to his stomach, but every time he tried to push the thoughts away, they crept back, more persistent than ever. In the small moments of silence, when the work in the fields had slowed or when Chica found himself alone in the village, the gun seemed to call out to him. He had hidden it under his bed, wrapped in a piece of old cloth, and every night he would pull it out, staring at it in the dim light of their one candle. The weapon was heavier than he had imagined, though small enough to fit in his hand. Chica had never fired a gun before, never even held one until Ogana had given it to him. It felt like an alien object, something that didn't belong in his world. And yet, it was now a part of him, an extension of the dark path he had chosen, or rather, the path that had been chosen for him. As the days passed, Chica began to feel the suffocating weight of time closing in on him. He knew the night was coming, the night when he would have to carry out the plan. Ogana had been clear there would be no backing out. If Chica failed, if he didn't go through with the murder, the consequences would be unimaginable. Ogana had made sure of that. He had looked Chica in the eyes, his voice low and steady, and told him in no uncertain terms what would happen if he betrayed his trust. There were others, Ogana had said, boys like Chica, who had failed in their tasks. Chica had never seen them again. The message was clear. But it wasn't just the fear of Ogana that gnawed at Chica's insides, it was something deeper, something more primal. A voice inside him, quiet at first, but growing louder with each passing day, screamed that this was wrong, that he was about to commit an unspeakable act. He tried to drown it out, telling himself over and over that he needed the money, that this was the only way to escape the crushing poverty that had defined his entire life. With 235 USD, he could leave Nimba behind forever. He could go to the city, find work, start a new life. He could give his father and sister a chance at a better future. That money represented everything he had ever dreamed of: freedom, security, a way out. But the voice inside him wouldn't be silenced. It whispered to him in the dark, reminding him of the Kamau family's innocence, of the fact that they had done nothing to deserve what was coming. Mr. Kamau wasn't a criminal. He wasn't someone who had harmed Chica or his family. In fact, he was known for helping people, for standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. Chica had heard his name mentioned in the village, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with scorn, but he had never paid much attention. Now, though, he couldn't stop thinking about it. He wondered if Mr. Kamau had ever helped boys like him, boys who had no way out, no future to speak of. As the final days approached, Chica's mind became a battleground. One part of him was filled with desperation, urging him to do what needed to be done, to take the money and run. But another part of him, deeper, more stubborn, recoiled at the thought of taking a life, let alone the lives of an entire family. He didn't want to be a killer. He didn't want to have blood on his hands. But the money seemed to hang in front of him like a promise, glittering and unreachable, unless he took this one final step. Chica tried to rationalize it. He told himself that this was just survival, that in a world as harsh as theirs, people did what they had to do. He had seen people steal, seen them fight over scraps of food, over a few coins, over land and livestock. Violence was a part of life in Nimba, as it was in so many other places. People killed for far less than $235. But this wasn't a fight over food, or money, or survival. This was different. This was cold, calculated murder. And Chica couldn't shake the feeling that once he crossed that line, there would be no going back. In the quiet moments, when the village was still and the only sounds were the distant calls of animals in the night, Chica would sit outside his small home, staring up at the sky. The stars, so bright and numerous in the rural darkness, seemed to mock him with their indifferent beauty. He wondered if they could see what was about to happen. He wondered if anyone was watching, if anyone would ever know what he had done. The idea that he could carry out this murder and simply disappear into the night seemed impossible. He felt as though the whole world would know the moment he pulled the trigger, that he would never be able to escape the weight of it. And yet he couldn't back out. Ogana had made that clear. The fear of what would happen if he failed, if he refused to go through with it, was just as powerful as the guilt gnawing at him. Ogana had connections, power that Chica couldn't begin to understand. He knew that if he didn't complete the task, his life wouldn't just go back to normal. Ogana would come for him, for his family, for anyone he cared about. Chica's father and sister would be caught in the crossfire, and their deaths would be on his hands too. The thought of his sister, Ngozi, suffering because of his failure made his blood run cold. She was only 8, innocent and full of life, still untouched by the darkness that seemed to hover around their family. So Chica tried to push the guilt aside. He tried to tell himself that this was the only way, that he had no choice. But the closer the day came, the harder it became to convince himself. Every time he looked at the gun, his stomach twisted in knots. He practiced holding it, feeling the weight of it in his hands, trying to imagine what it would feel like to pull the trigger. The gun felt alien to him, an object that didn't belong in his world, and yet it was now the key to his future. One night, just days before the murder, Chica couldn't sleep. The heat in the small hut was unbearable, and his thoughts were racing too fast for him to find any peace. He sat up, staring at the shadows that danced on the walls, listening to the sound of his father's heavy breathing as he slept on the other side of the room. Chica's mind kept returning to the Camo family. He imagined them in their home, just as they were now sleeping peacefully, unaware of the danger that was about to descend upon them. He wondered what they were like, what kind of people they really were. He had heard Mr. Camo speak once, at a community meeting, though he hadn't paid much attention at the time. Camo had spoken about justice, about fairness, about standing up for those who had no voice. Chica had barely understood what he meant, but now those words echoed in his mind, taunting him. How could he kill a man who believed in such things? How could he destroy a family that had done nothing to him? The thoughts swirled in his head like a storm, battering him from all sides. He thought about his own family, his father, who had worked himself to the bone to provide for them, and Ngozi, who looked up to him with wide, trusting eyes. He was doing this for them, he told himself. He was doing it so that they wouldn't have to suffer anymore. But the justification felt hollow, a flimsy excuse to cover the deeper truth. Chica wasn't just doing this for his family, he was doing it for himself. He wanted to escape the life he had been born into, to be free of the poverty that had shackled him since birth. But at what cost? The internal conflict raged on, growing louder and more unbearable with each passing day. Chica found himself caught between two worlds, one where he could be free, and one where he could still live with himself. He tried to bury his doubts, to push them down deep inside where they couldn't hurt him. But they kept rising to the surface, like bubbles in boiling water, impossible to ignore. Finally, the day arrived. The sun set, casting long shadows over the village, and Chica knew that the time had come. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of what he was about to do. He could feel the weight of the gun against his side, hidden beneath his shirt. The metal felt cold against his skin, a constant reminder of the task ahead. There was no turning back now. The die had been cast. As the darkness deepened and the stars began to appear in the sky, Chica left his home, the quiet of the night swallowing him whole. Each step he took felt heavy, as though his feet were made of lead. His mind raced with thoughts of what was to come, of the lives he was about to end, and of the future that awaited him once it was done. The night of the crime descended on Nimba with a stillness that felt almost unnatural. The village, normally buzzing with the quiet hum of crickets and distant murmurs of late-night conversations, was eerily silent. A thick, humid heat clung to the air, pressing down on everything like a weight. The moon hung low in the sky, a sliver of pale light casting long, eerie shadows over the houses and dirt roads. It was a night that felt suffocated, as if the entire world was holding its breath in anticipation of something terrible. Chica's heart raced in his chest as he moved through the narrow paths of the village, the gun hidden beneath his loose shirt feeling like a block of ice against his skin. His footsteps were light, barely audible over the faint crunch of the dry earth beneath him, but each step felt deafening in his own ears. Every rustle of leaves, every distant sound, made him flinch, as if the world itself knew what he was about to do. He kept his head down, avoiding the few dim lights still flickering in the windows of nearby huts. He had memorized the path to the Camo house, scouted it in daylight, but now in the darkness, everything seemed distorted, twisted. The familiar landmarks looked different, more sinister. The Camo home stood at the edge of the village, slightly removed from the cluster of other houses. It was larger than most, built from sturdy concrete, a sign of Mr. Camo's relative wealth. The house had always been a symbol of something better in Nimba, a place where success and community leadership intertwined, where hope lived. But tonight it loomed like a dark monolith, casting a shadow that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. Chica could see the outline of the house from a distance as he approached, the lights inside dimmed, giving the impression that the family was either asleep or close to it. The time had come. The plan had been simple: get in, do the job, and get out. Oguna had been clear this wasn't meant to be messy, and it wasn't meant to leave any survivors. Chica had run the plan over and over in his mind in the days leading up to this night, trying to make it seem like a series of cold, mechanical steps. But standing at the edge of the Camo property, staring at the house, everything felt impossibly complicated, terrifyingly real. His hands shook as he crouched low, moving toward the back of the house, just as Oguna had instructed. There was a small gate that led to the garden at the rear, where the family often grew vegetables. The gate creaked softly as Chica pushed it open, a sound that made his heart jump in his chest, but there was no one around to hear it. As he crept closer to the house, the familiar smells of the village, a mix of wood smoke, earth, and distant cooking fires, seemed to cling to the air, grounding him for just a moment in the world he knew. But that grounding was fleeting, slipping away as he reached the back door. Chica paused, his breath shallow and quick. His hand hovered over the handle of the door, the cool metal sending another shiver through him. This was it. There was no turning back now. He glanced around one last time, as if expecting anyone to appear and stop him, to save him from what he was about to do. But the night remained still and empty, the village sleeping, oblivious to the violence about to unfold. With a shaky breath, Chica turned the handle and pushed the door open. It swung inward with barely a sound, revealing the dimly lit kitchen. The Kamal house was quiet, save for the soft ticking of a clock somewhere in the distance and the faint sound of someone shifting in their sleep. Chica stepped inside, his bare feet moving silently across the cool, tiled floor. The house smelled faintly of spices and stew, remnants of a dinner long since eaten. It was a home warm, lived in, a place where love and laughter had once flourished. But tonight it felt like a tomb, cold and foreboding. The gun felt heavier now, as if the weight of what it represented was too much to bear. Chica's hand trembled as he gripped it tighter, his knuckles white against the dull metal. His mind raced, a blur of thoughts and images: his father's tired face, Ngozie's wide, innocent eyes, the Kamal family sitting around their dinner table, unaware of the danger closing in around them. But he forced the thoughts away. He had to focus. He had to get this done. The house was small enough that Chica knew the layout from his brief observations. To the left was the hallway that led to the bedrooms, where the family would be sleeping. He moved slowly, his breath catching in his throat with every step, his heart pounding in his ears so loudly he was sure it would wake someone. The hallway stretched out before him, narrow and dark, the walls lined with faded family photos, pictures of Mr. Kamal with his wife Adana, their two children, Said and Juma, smiling and happy in better times. Chica's eyes flickered over the images, but he quickly looked away. He couldn't afford to think about them as people. Not now. He reached the first door, slightly ajar, and paused, listening. Inside, the soft, steady breathing of someone asleep filled the room. Chica's stomach churned as he pushed the door open with his free hand. The faint moonlight filtering through the thin curtains revealed the sleeping figure of Mr. Kamal. The man lay on his back, his chest rising and falling in the deep rhythm of sleep, utterly unaware of the intruder standing in the doorway. Chica stood frozen for a moment, his hand tightening on the grip of the gun, his breath shallow and uneven. This was the moment he had dreaded the most. The moment where thought and reality collided, where the dark fantasy of what he had agreed to do became real. Chica's hand trembled violently as he raised the gun, pointing it at Mr. Kamal's head. The man's face was peaceful, his brow relaxed, his mouth slightly open in the vulnerability of sleep. He looked so ordinary, so human. Chica's mind screamed at him to stop, to run, to throw the gun away and forget any of this had ever happened. But his body moved on autopilot, driven by fear and desperation, the weight of Ogana's threats hanging over him like a guillotine. His finger hovered over the trigger, and for a split second, time seemed to freeze. The world went silent, as if everything, the air, the night, the universe was waiting for what came next. Chica's heart raced, his palms slick with sweat. Then, in a single, brutal motion, he squeezed the trigger. The sound of the gunshot shattered the silence like a thunderclap. Mr. Kamal's body jerked violently, a sickeningly final movement, and then went still. Blood spattered the white sheets and the headboard, dark and glistening in the dim light. Chica's ears rang from the shot, the noise reverberating through the small house, louder than he had anticipated. He stood there, frozen, his hand still gripping the gun, his mind struggling to process what he had just done. For a brief moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis, and Chica felt as though he might collapse, the weight of his actions crashing down on him all at once. But there was no time to dwell on it. He had to move. The others were still asleep, unaware of the horror unfolding around them. Chica backed out of the room, his body trembling uncontrollably. His stomach churned, and for a moment he thought he might be sick. But he swallowed hard, forcing the bile back down, and moved toward the next door. This one was closed, the wooden surface cool under his fingertips as he hesitated for a heartbeat, gathering what little courage he had left. Inside, he knew, would be Adana and their youngest child, Juma. The thought of killing the boy made Chica's heart twist painfully, But there was no turning back now. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking softly in the stillness of the night. Inside, the room was small and sparsely furnished, with a single bed against one wall and a smaller cot against the other. Adana lay curled up under a thin blanket, her back to the door, while Juma, no more than 8 years old, slept soundly in his cot, his small body stretched out, arms flung wide in the innocent abandon of childhood. The sight of the boy hit Chika like a punch to the gut. He was so young, so small. How could he do this? But the cold, metallic weight of the gun in his hand reminded him of Ogana's threats, of the promises made and the consequences if he failed. Chika couldn't afford to hesitate. He had to finish what he started. He stepped into the room, his heart hammering in his chest, the taste of bile rising in his throat again. Adana stirred slightly in her sleep, shifting under the blanket, but she didn't wake. Chika's hand shook as he raised the gun again, aiming it at her head. He hesitated for the briefest of moments, and then, with a deep, shuddering breath, he squeezed the trigger. The shot was loud in the small room, the sound bouncing off the walls, deafening. Adana jerked once, and then fell still, the blood spreading quickly across the pillow beneath her head. For a moment, Chika stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. His ears rang, his vision swam, and all he could see was the blood, so much blood. But then a small sound pulled him back to the present. Juma had stirred, his small body shifting under the thin blanket as he slowly woke from the noise. His eyes fluttered open, and in the dim light, Chika saw the confusion on his face, the way his innocent, sleepy expression turned to fear as he took in the scene before him. Chika's heart nearly stopped. The boy looked up at Chika, his wide, frightened eyes locking onto the figure standing in the darkness with a gun. There was no recognition, no understanding, only terror. Chika's breath caught in his throat as he realized what he had to do. He couldn't leave any witnesses. That was part of the deal. No survivors. With tears stinging his eyes, Chika raised the gun one last time, pointing it at the boy's head. Juma whimpered, a small, pitiful sound that broke something inside Chika, but he couldn't stop. He had no choice. His hand shook violently, his whole body trembling with the weight of what he was about to do. And then, in one final, devastating moment, he pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the room, and Juma's small body went limp, collapsing back onto the bed, motionless. Chika stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the scene before him, the bodies of Adana and Juma, lifeless and still, the blood soaking into the sheets, the walls, the floor. His mind was numb, his body cold, his heart a heavy, leaden weight in his chest. He had done it. He had killed them all. The morning after the massacre, the village of Nimba awoke as if it were any other day. The sun rose, casting its warm glow over the cracked earth and dust-covered huts, while roosters crowed to signal the start of another day of toil. For the villagers, it was business as usual. The marketplace bustled with early morning activity, children prepared for school, and farmers headed to their fields, unaware of the unspeakable tragedy that had unfolded during the night. But the quiet of dawn would soon be shattered by the news that would spread like wildfire, plunging the village into chaos. The first sign that something was wrong came when Said Kamal, the eldest daughter of the Kamal family, didn't show up for school. Said was known for her punctuality and dedication, and it wasn't like her to miss a day without good reason. The teacher, Mrs. Olamide, noticed her absence and felt a pang of concern. She knew the Kamal family well, everyone in Nimba did. They were pillars of the community, respected and admired for their kindness and generosity. Mrs. Olamide decided to wait until mid-morning before sending one of the older students, Ayo, to the Kamal house to check on them. She assumed it was a minor issue, perhaps Said had fallen ill, or her father had needed her to help with something at home. But as the hours ticked by, a strange feeling began to settle over the village. People noticed that not only Said, but also her younger brother Juma was missing from school. Even more unsettling, Mr. Kamal hadn't left for his usual teaching job in the neighboring town, and no one had seen his wife, Adana, since the previous afternoon. By noon, the village had started to whisper. Something wasn't right. The Kamal family's absence was too conspicuous to ignore. At that point, Ayo still hadn't returned from the Kamal house, and Mrs. Olamide's concern deepened. She decided to send a second student, a quiet girl named Ebel, to check on both Ayo and the Kamals. Ebel, nervous but obedient, left the schoolhouse and made her way to the edge of the village where the Kamal home stood. It was a route she had walked many times before, but today it felt different. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding that she couldn't shake. As she approached the Kamal house, she noticed that the front door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible through the gap. Her heart quickened. Ebel hesitated, her feet rooted to the spot as a chill ran down her spine. The Kamal house, usually so welcoming, felt like a place she didn't want to enter. But Io still hadn't returned, and she knew Mrs. Olamide would be expecting her to report back. Gathering what little courage she had, Ebel called out softly, her voice trembling. But there was no answer. The house remained eerily silent, the only sound the distant rustle of the wind through the trees. She took a deep breath and stepped closer, pushing the door open a little wider. The sight that greeted her made her blood run cold. Inside, the Kamal house was bathed in an unnatural, horrifying stillness. The first thing Ebel noticed was the smell of thick, metallic scent that clung to the air, mingling with the faint, lingering aroma of spices from the previous night's dinner. Then, she saw the bodies. Mr. Kamal lay on the floor of the main room, his eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. His face, once so full of life and strength, was now a frozen mask of death. Blood pooled beneath him, a dark, congealing stain spreading across the floor. Ebel couldn't breathe. Her vision swam as she stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth in a desperate attempt to stifle the scream that rose in her throat. She didn't need to look further to know that the rest of the family had met the same fate, but as her eyes flickered to the hallway, she caught a glimpse of more bodies. Adana, Said, Juma crumpled in their beds, lifeless and still, the sheets soaked with blood. For a moment, Ebel couldn't move. Her body felt frozen, trapped in that awful heart-stopping moment. Her mind struggled to process the carnage in front of her, the brutal reality that the entire Kamal family had been slaughtered in their own home. She wanted to run, to scream, to escape the nightmare that had suddenly become real, but her legs wouldn't respond. Finally, the adrenaline surged through her, and she turned on her heel, fleeing from the house as fast as her legs would carry her. Her bare feet pounded the dirt road as she sprinted back toward the village, her breath coming in ragged gasps, tears streaming down her face. The horror of what she had seen clung to her, making it impossible to think of anything else. She didn't stop running until she reached the schoolhouse, where she burst through the doors, collapsing into a sobbing heap on the floor. Mrs. Olamide rushed to her side, alarmed by the girl's obvious distress. It took several minutes for Ebel to calm down enough to speak, and when she finally did, the words tumbled out in a rush, incoherent at first but slowly forming a picture of the nightmare she had witnessed. As the story spread through the classroom, a wave of disbelief and terror swept over the students. The Kamal family gone? Murdered? It didn't seem possible. The Kamal family was untouchable, pillars of strength and morality in a community where life was often hard and unfair. Within minutes, word had spread throughout the entire village. People dropped what they were doing and gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed, frantic voices. The Kamal family had been found dead in their home, and the details of the scene were too gruesome to ignore. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, villagers began to make their way to the Kamal house, the atmosphere heavy with shock and dread. The police were called, but everyone knew it would take hours for them to arrive from the nearest town, and even then, the sense of hopelessness was overwhelming. Whoever had done this was long gone. The first villager to arrive at the house after Ebel was Mr. Adigok, a local elder and close friend of Mr. Kamal. He had heard the news and refused to believe it until he saw it with his own eyes. But when he entered the house and saw the bodies, his knees buckled, and he had to steady himself against the doorframe. The scene was worse than anything he could have imagined. He had seen death before many times, in fact, but not like this. This was a massacre, something savage and cold, the kind of violence that didn't belong in their village. Mr. Adigok stepped further into the house, his heart pounding in his chest as he took in the full horror of what had been done to his friend's family. Mr. Kamal lay in the middle of the floor, his body crumpled and bloody, and in the bedrooms, the bodies of Adana and the children lay in twisted, unnatural positions, as if they had been caught in the middle of peaceful sleep and ripped violently into death. The house, once a place of warmth and safety, was now a tomb. The arrival of more villagers outside the house brought a sudden, collective intake of breath. Women wailed in disbelief, their cries rising into the air like a funeral dirge. Men shook their heads, their faces pale with shock, as they gathered around the entrance, reluctant to enter but unable to turn away from the terrible reality of what had happened. The Kamau family, so beloved and respected, was gone, murdered in cold blood, and no one knew why. The local police arrived by midday, led by Inspector Nwachukwu, a seasoned officer who had seen his fair share of violent crime in the larger towns and cities. But this was something different. The sight that greeted him as he entered the Kamau house shook even his hardened demeanor. The brutality, the senselessness of it all, left him momentarily speechless. He knew, without a doubt, that this wasn't the work of a simple thief or someone driven by passion. This was something far darker, more calculated. The village was thrown into chaos as Inspector Nwachukwu and his team began their investigation. They cordoned off the house, keeping the growing crowd of villagers at bay as they took photographs, collected evidence, and tried to piece together what had happened. But the evidence was sparse. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no footprints that would lead them to the killer. Whoever had done this had been careful, methodical, leaving little trace of their presence. The only clue the police found was a single shell casing from the bullets that had killed the family, lying near Mr. Kamau's body. As the hours passed, the weight of the tragedy pressed down on the village like a heavy fog. People huddled in small groups, whispering theories and rumors, their voices low and fearful. Some speculated that it had been a robbery gone wrong, though it was clear that nothing had been taken from the house. Others whispered about enemies Mr. Kamau might have made through his advocacy work, his outspoken support for LGBTQ rights having earned him many enemies in the conservative village. But no one could imagine who would be capable of such an act of slaughtering an entire family in cold blood. By nightfall, the village was in a state of paralysis. Fear and grief had settled over Nimba like a shroud, and for the first time in memory, people began locking their doors at night, afraid of what or who might be lurking in the shadows. The Kamau family's deaths had shaken the community to its core. This wasn't just a murder, it was an assault on the very fabric of their society, a brutal reminder that even in a place as small and close-knit as Nimba, evil could strike without warning. Meanwhile, Chika, the boy responsible for the massacre, wandered through the village in a daze, his mind numb and detached from the reality of what he had done. He had carried out the plan just as Ogana had instructed, but the weight of the act was more than he could bear. He had thought that the money, the $235 that Ogana had promised him, would make everything worth it, that it would give him and his family a way out of the crushing poverty that had defined their lives. But now the money felt like a curse, a reminder of the blood on his hands, the lives he had stolen. Chika had left the Kamau house under the cover of darkness, slipping back into his own home unnoticed. His father and sister had been asleep when he returned, and Chika had lain awake in his small bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to force the images of the dead family out of his mind. But they wouldn't leave him. Mr. Kamau's lifeless eyes, Adana's twisted body, little Juma's small, broken frame, they haunted him, replaying over and over in his mind like a nightmare he couldn't escape. As the days passed, Chika became increasingly paranoid, convinced that the villagers knew what he had done. Every glance, every whisper, felt like an accusation, and he found himself avoiding the places he once frequented. He couldn't look anyone in the eye, couldn't speak without fear that his voice would betray him. The guilt was suffocating, a constant weight on his chest that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. Ogana, for his part, had disappeared. Chika hadn't seen him since the night of the crime, and part of him wondered if the man had ever truly existed, or if he had simply been a figment of his own desperation. The money, too, seemed like a distant, hollow reward now. Chika had hidden it under his bed, but he couldn't bring himself to touch it. It felt tainted, soaked in the blood of the Kamau family, a reminder of the price he had paid for a future that no longer seemed possible. The village of Nimba mourned the loss of the Kamau family for weeks, their funeral attended by nearly every villager, their graves marked by simple stones in the village cemetery. The mystery of their deaths remained unsolved, the investigation dragging on with no leads, no suspects. And as time passed, the once vibrant community grew more fragmented, the shadow of the massacre lingering like a dark cloud over their lives. Chika, consumed by guilt and fear, retreated further into himself, his once innocent eyes now hollow and distant. The boy who had been willing to kill for money had become a ghost, haunted by the lives he had taken, forever marked by the night of the crime that had changed everything. For weeks after the Kamau family's murder, the village of Nimba remained in a state of tense, suffocating silence. The brutal crime had shaken the community to its core, and although life went on, nothing felt the same. The once vibrant village was now overshadowed by the horrific event, and the police investigation seemed to be getting nowhere. Rumors and speculation continued to swirl around the village, but no one had any real answers. The Kamo family's killer remained at large, and with each passing day, the sense of dread deepened. Inspector Inwachukwu and his small team of officers had combed through the Kamo house for clues, but the scene had yielded little to go on. The crime had been carried out with cold, calculated precision. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, no fingerprints, and no physical evidence that could point them in the direction of the killer. The only tangible clue was the single shell casing found near Mr. Kamal's body, but even that seemed to lead nowhere. The inspector had interviewed nearly everyone in the village, but no one had seen or heard anything unusual that night. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only death and confusion. Despite the lack of progress in the investigation, one thing became increasingly clear to Inspector Inwachukwu: this was not a random act of violence. The Kamal family had been targeted for a reason. Mr. Kamal's advocacy for LGBTQ rights had earned him both respect and animosity in the village and beyond. In a conservative community like Nimba, his outspoken support for marginalized groups had made him enemies, powerful ones. But which of these enemies had the means and motive to carry out such a heinous act remained a mystery. As the investigation dragged on, pressure mounted on the police to make an arrest. The villagers were growing restless, their fear slowly transforming into frustration and anger. They wanted justice for the Kamal family, and they wanted it soon. But without any concrete leads, Inspector Inwachukwu felt trapped, his every move scrutinized by both the villagers and his superiors. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he was missing, some crucial piece of the puzzle that had yet to reveal itself. Meanwhile, Chika, the boy who had committed the murders, lived in a state of perpetual terror. Each day was an agonizing battle against the crushing weight of his guilt. He had done what Ogana had asked of him, but the aftermath of the crime had been far worse than he had anticipated. The murders haunted him, every moment of the killings replayed in his mind over and over again. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and each time he closed his eyes, he saw the lifeless faces of Mr. Kamal, Adana, Said, and Juma, their blood staining his hands. The money Ogana had given him was hidden away, untouched, as if it carried a curse. Chika had thought it would bring him freedom, but now it felt like a noose tightening around his neck. In the weeks following the crime, Chika became increasingly paranoid. He was certain that the villagers knew what he had done, even though no one had confronted him. Every glance, every whisper felt like an accusation. He avoided his friends, skipped school, and spent most of his days hiding in the shadowed corners of the village, trying to avoid drawing attention to himself. His father, who had noticed Chika's strange behavior, grew concerned but didn't know how to approach his son. The village, after all, was gripped by the murder investigation, and everyone had their own fears to contend with. Chika's mental state began to deteriorate rapidly. He had thought that killing the Kamal family would be quick, clean, and that he could move on. But the act itself had left scars deeper than he had imagined. The terror of being discovered, the crushing guilt of having taken innocent lives, it all became too much to bear. And still, Ogana had disappeared. Chika hadn't seen him since the night of the murders, and part of him wondered if Ogana had abandoned him altogether, leaving him to deal with the consequences alone. The paranoia that had been gnawing at Chika finally reached its breaking point one afternoon when he overheard a conversation between two of the village elders. They were discussing the investigation, speculating about who might be responsible for the murders. One of them mentioned that the police had been looking into possible motives connected to Mr. Kamal's advocacy work. Chika's blood ran cold. He knew then that it was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots, before someone figured out that the murders had been orchestrated by someone with an agenda, someone like Ogana. And if they figured that out, it wouldn't be long before they came after him. In a moment of panic, Chika made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't take the pressure anymore. The guilt was too much, the fear too suffocating. He needed to confess. He needed to tell someone what he had done, to unburden himself of the secret that was slowly destroying him. That evening, after the sun had set and the village had begun to quiet down, Chika slipped away from his home and made his way to the police station. His heart pounded in his chest as he walked through the empty streets, each step feeling heavier than the last. When Chika arrived at the small, dimly lit police station, he stood outside for several long moments, his mind racing with doubts. Could he really do this? Could he confess to the murders and face the consequences? But there was no turning back now. He had made his decision. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. Inspector Inwachukwu was seated at his desk, poring over a pile of reports when he heard the door creak open. He looked up, surprised to see the young boy standing in the doorway, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide with fear. Inwachukwu frowned, sensing that something was very wrong. Chika took a few tentative steps forward, his legs trembling beneath him. Before the inspector could ask what was wrong, Chika spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He told the inspector everything: how Ogana had approached him, how he had been promised money in exchange for killing the Kamal family, how he had snuck into their home that night and shot each of them in cold blood. As he spoke, tears streamed down his face, his voice breaking with the weight of his confession. Inwachukwu listened in stunned silence, his expression unreadable as Chika poured out the details of the crime, his words heavy with guilt and remorse. When Chika finished, there was a long, suffocating silence in the room. Inspector Inwachukwu leaned back in his chair, his mind racing to process the boy's confession. It was hard to believe a 13-year-old boy responsible for such a brutal crime. And yet, as Chika stood before him, trembling and broken, Inwachukwu knew that the boy was telling the truth. The details of the crime fit too perfectly, and the raw emotion in Chika's voice was impossible to fake. Inwachukwu felt a surge of anger toward Ogana, the man who had manipulated this boy, who had turned him into a killer. But there was no time to dwell on that now. The inspector stood up and placed a hand on Chika's shoulder, leading him to a chair by the desk. He needed to get a full statement to document the confession and begin the process of arresting Chika. But first, he needed more information about Ogana, the man who had orchestrated the entire crime. Chika, still shaken from the weight of his confession, explained everything he knew about Ogana. He told the inspector about how Ogana had arrived in the village a few years ago, how he had quickly become a figure of fear and authority, and how he had approached Chika with the offer of 235 USD in exchange for the murders. Chika described the cold, calculated way in which Ogana had given him the instructions, how he had provided the gun, and how he had disappeared after the crime was done. With each detail that Chika revealed, Inspector Inwachukwu's anger deepened. Ogana had used this boy as a pawn in his twisted game, exploiting his desperation and manipulating him into committing a crime that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But now that Chika had come forward, there was finally a chance to bring Ogana to justice. Inwachukwu promised himself that he wouldn't rest until the man who had orchestrated the Kamal family's murder was caught and punished. The next morning, Chika was formally arrested. Word of his confession spread quickly through the village, and by midday, a crowd had gathered outside the police station. The villagers, who had been paralyzed by fear and uncertainty for weeks, were now consumed with shock and outrage. The news that a boy, one of their own, had been responsible for the massacre was too much for many to comprehend. Mothers wept openly, fathers shook their heads in disbelief, and children whispered to one another in hushed voices, trying to make sense of the unthinkable. But the shock of Chika's confession was soon overshadowed by the revelation that Ogana had been the mastermind behind the crime. As word spread that Chika had been manipulated by a powerful outsider, the villagers' anger turned outward. Ogana had always been a figure of fear in the community, but now he became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in their once peaceful village. The villagers demanded justice, and they looked to Inspector Inwachukwu to deliver it. The hunt for Ogana began immediately. Inwachukwu and his team launched an intensive search, scouring the surrounding villages and the neighboring towns for any trace of him. They questioned everyone who had ever come into contact with him, piecing together a web of criminal connections that stretched far beyond Nimba. It became clear that Ogana was not just a local thug, he was part of a larger network, a man with dangerous allies and deep ties to the criminal underworld. Weeks passed, and despite their best efforts, Ogana remained elusive. Inwachukwu knew that the longer Ogana stayed at large, the more dangerous he became. The inspector felt the weight of the village's expectations on his shoulders, but he refused to give up. The Kamal family's murder had shaken the very foundation of Nimba, and until Ogana was brought to justice, there would be no peace. During this time, Chika remained in custody, awaiting trial. His confession had spared the village the uncertainty of an unresolved crime, but it had done little to ease the pain and anger that simmered just beneath the surface. The villagers were divided in their feelings toward Chika. Some saw him as a victim, an impressionable boy who had been manipulated by a far more dangerous man. Others viewed him as a monster, incapable of forgiveness for what he had done. The murder of the Kamal family had left a deep scar on the village, and Chika's presence was a constant reminder of the tragedy. In his cell, Chica was consumed by guilt. He spent his days in silence, replaying the events of that terrible night over and over again in his mind. He knew there was no going back, no undoing what he had done. The Kama family was gone, and he had been the one to take their lives. The weight of that truth was unbearable, and at times Chica wondered if he even deserved to live. But there was no escape from his fate now. He had confessed, and the only thing left was to face the consequences. Months later, just as the village's hope for justice had begun to wane, news broke that Ogana had been captured. He had been found hiding in a remote village miles away, trying to evade capture by blending in with the local population. But a tip-off had led the police to his location, and after a brief standoff, Ogana was arrested and brought back to Nimba. His capture was a moment of catharsis for the village, a small measure of justice in the wake of so much loss. Ogana's trial was swift and decisive. The evidence against him was overwhelming, thanks in large part to Chika's confession, which detailed Ogana's role in orchestrating the murders. Ogana remained defiant throughout the proceedings, showing no remorse for his actions. But in the end, the verdict was clear. Ogana was sentenced to life in prison for his role in the Kamo family's murder. Chika's trial followed soon after. His confession had left little room for doubt, and although he was only 13, the gravity of his crime could not be ignored. The court recognized that Chika had been manipulated by Ogana, and his age was taken into consideration. But the fact remained that Chika had pulled the trigger, and for that he would have to face the consequences. Chika was sentenced to a juvenile detention facility, where he would remain until he turned 18, at which point his case would be re-evaluated. In the aftermath of the trials, Nimba slowly began to heal, though the scars of the Kamo family's murder would never fully fade. The village, once so tight-knit, had been forever changed by the events of that fateful night. Trust, once taken for granted, had been shattered, and the sense of safety that the villagers had once felt was gone. But there was also a sense of closure. The killer had been caught, and the man who had manipulated him had been brought to justice. As for Chika, he would spend the rest of his youth behind bars, haunted by the lives he had taken and the choices he had made. The boy who had once dreamed of escaping poverty had found himself trapped in a far darker fate than he could have ever imagined.